when you put your writing out there, when you put yourself out there, there's always going to be people who don't like what you're doing. And some of them will be vocal. And so then you can let that eat at you. Right. And sometimes I have, sometimes I'll perseverate over someone I don't even know, their comment on something that I wrote, who doesn't even know what they're talking about. And it just gnaws at me. And so I've found like it is difficult and you have to just keep at it, right? And if it's your writing or it's your passion, in my case, about our business model and hybrid and the work that we're doing in the world, I always am centered by the fact that I know we're doing good work.
What does it take to put your life's work out there in a really big way? How much can I do with this one precious life? Welcome to The Selfish Gift.
I'm really excited about this conversation today because I can't quite imagine which direction it's going to go in. My guest today is a publishing professional, a veteran of the industry, and is involved in books and writing and publishing from so many different angles. We've just got a bunch of different ways to approach this topic. Brooke Warner is the publisher of She Writes Press and Spark Press. She is an in-demand book coach and publishing consultant. She's the former executive editor of Seal Press and a TEDx speaker. She writes a column for Publishers Weekly, and she co-hosts the weekly Right-Minded podcast with Grant Faulkner. Now, if that doesn't sound like a lot to you, then consider that Brooke is also the author of multiple books of her own, including Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, and 3 books on memoir. What's even more exciting about than that is that Brooke is currently at work on her very own memoir. So, Brooke, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my gosh, Maggie, it's my honor and pleasure. Great to see you.
We have been friends for years and colleagues and compatriots in the hybrid publishing space. So I'm very excited to talk to you a lot about hybrid publishing, what it is, what you make of it, how you got into it, and all of that. But there's just so much for us to discuss. You do so many different things, Brooke, but at the center of all of them is books and publishing. Can you just speak to us for a minute about why do books matter to you so much, and how did you come to this life?
Gosh, yeah, I can't even imagine my life without books being at the center. So I love you homing in on that. It's so obvious, and yet no one's ever asked me that before. I've always been a big reader, but unlike, so many authors you'll hear, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. That wasn't me. It's not like this lifelong love affair I had with this concept of being an author someday, but I have always loved books. And so I think that when I went to college and I studied international relations and I thought I wanted to do something big in the world with NGOs, and I loved travel and I spoke Spanish and I had all these designs on a very different life, but I didn't love the experience that I had in college with that. And I thought to myself, okay, I have a degree. What am I going to do? And my mom at the time just said, well, what do you love? And I said, well, I love reading. I love books. And
Thanks,
she
Mom.
said, I know, right?
It's great.
I was like, oh, well, you could have a career like doing something with books. And so that was it. It really opened up this prospect to something I hadn't considered before. And so I was 23. I had recently graduated from college and taken a year off. And then I got a job in book publishing. And that is really where it started. And it just perfectly suited me in so many ways in terms of engaging my curiosity and the complexity of the industry. And I found my spot.
That's awesome. And I didn't realize that you were initially putting yourself on a life path toward, activism or social change or working with NGOs. But that actually doesn't surprise me one bit, knowing the approach that you take to publishing and the books that you care about. How do you think that that ethos or your own kind of personal mission has shaped your career in publishing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've always sort of not totally intentionally, but been a champion of the underdog, right? I've worked in sort of esoteric spaces in publishing because my first publishing house that I worked for was a spiritual, metaphysical therapy modality press. It wasn't super mainstream. And then I got the job at Seal Press, and it was all women women authors, right? So we were a female publisher, and that, it's not esoteric, but it's very specific. And the kinds of books that I was tasked to acquire were very specific and specifically feminist. And so there's been this ethos of, championing certain kinds of voices, championing voices on the margins, sometimes voices that are not mainstream or less than popular. And that's informed absolutely everything I do. I'm not particularly interested in the glossy mainstream stuff that Seal, when it was getting acquired by bigger and bigger publishers, was trying to push me to acquire, and it just didn't fit me.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. So, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about how one of the most wonderful things about working in publishing is that we love books on two different levels, right? We love the act of making a book. We love working with words. We love shaping just the sort of the practical craft of shaping ideas and getting them onto the page, or stories and getting them onto the page. But we also love, if we're lucky, to work in a publishing company that is aligned with our interests in terms of its content. We love being able to immerse ourselves in those ideas and in that material. So you're really spending your life engaging with concepts that really matter to you.
Absolutely. And that's been a big gift. And I think that's also why I said it suited me so much. It's never the same thing. The mechanics of making a book are, but every book is different. Every author is different. And it's a challenging job in the sense of, it requires a lot of you. It requires your presence. It requires that you show up and that you bring a lot of yourself to the table. And that's been exciting over all of these years, and sometimes I get angry and sometimes I'm in love, and it just, there's all these emotions too that are part of being in the publishing industry. I'm sure that's true in other industries too, but I like that it keeps me on my toes and always learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And Brooke, you've been, even within the publishing industry, a little bit of a iconoclastic figure, a little bit of maybe a rabble rouser in terms of, if not originating, then definitely championing hybrid publishing as a model, and being a very early upfront spokesperson, educating the industry and educating the public on what hybrid publishing is. So, of course, I share that interest with you, being a hybrid publisher myself. But let me ask you, can you please define hybrid publishing in a nutshell? Tell us what it is, how it works.
Yeah, hybrid publishing is an alternative publishing model that is neither self-publishing nor traditional publishing, but which borrows, in my opinion, the best aspects of both, right? So hybrid, in my original conception of hybrid, it was kind of anything between the two, right? It was the gray zone. It was the middle way. Of course, when I really started to talk about it, not only myself, but my authors and other people wanted that to be better defined. And so over the years, and in my work, particularly with Independent Book Publishers Association, and you and I have both sat on the board of that association, I've worked to define the hybrid publishing to be something much more specific. But in the beginning, that was really it. It was an author subsidized model always, and it was always with much higher royalties to the author. And it always had a very strict vetting process, because I was interested in the the work. And the reason that I started She Writes Press in the first place was because I was rejecting great books at Seal Press. And the only reason we were rejecting them was because the author didn't have a platform or a brand. The only reason. And so when I got to She Writes and had my own thing, I thought the only thing I'm not going to care about is the author brand and platform. It's only going to be about the writing. But I knew that the writing had to be strong. We couldn't just publish anything or else we would just be a service provider, right? So I didn't want to do that. I really wanted to have a publishing house. So it has figured itself out over these many years. And you're right, I've been involved in championing it and working to define it and all of those things. But now we do have a criteria, as you know, and you helped me work on, right? So there is a very specific list of what it is. And it's hard to define in a nutshell, which I think is why
it's actually like nine nutshells, right? There are like nine criteria.
Yes. And I think that's exactly why it remains a gray zone for people, and why it's also easily co-opted, right? Because there are lots of people, as you and I know, some of them legitimate service providers and some of them predatory business models that are calling themselves hybrid and they are not. And so I just see myself out there as continuing to educate, but sometimes fighting because it's necessary, and it's an important space that gets thrown a lot of confusion our way.
Yeah, I agree. So what do you find people misunderstand most about hybrid publishing, or how is it how is that term misapplied to companies or firms that you think are not bona fide hybrid publishers?
I think one of the biggest things about hybrid publishing is that there is such a range, right? You have some of us, you and I included, who are really much more like traditional publishing houses. And it's an author subsidized model and the author gets a higher royalty. But in every way, shape, and form, the way that we're operating and doing business is being a house, right? And things are done a certain way. And then you have other hybrids who either they have looser standards or they let the authors, drive the ship more than we would, that kind of thing. And so I think because each house is different in its approach, you're always going to have a range of quality. That's true of traditional publishing as well. And so because of the lack of regulation, what happens in hybrid publishing, I think, is that some people are like, wow, these houses are doing amazing work and they are setting a gold standard, but there are these other ones over here that are not. And so this whole notion that, a rising tide lifts all boats is important in hybrid as well, because if there's a company calling itself hybrid and either it's not meeting all the criteria or its books aren't up to the standard that I would expect them to be, it creates an image problem, I think, for the entirety of the category. So I think that's the largest problem. And then I think there's a real dispute within hybrid itself around distribution and how important distribution is, and whether that needs to be a major measure or not. And that's always going to be, I think, a point of conversation and perhaps leading to confusion. And then finally is the predatory business models, who are actually predatory, going after authors, and they're not hybrids. They are just wanting to charge them, and they're preying on their dreams and their egos. And that is highly problematic. But the more people who want to write books, the more you're going to see those kinds of business models out there. So we just it's this vast ecosystem, and just like in the ocean, there are bad fish and there are, great schools over here. I mean, it just is like, it's a complicated terrain. And I think ever more so, more so now than even 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad that I'm really glad that you brought up distribution. It's like you're stealing questions out of my mouth, which is great because I want to talk about that. But just to touch on the predatory aspect of things, because I'm in a position, I find myself in a position where it's important to defend what we do and draw a distinction between our program and those more predatory actors, which I think boils down to planting false hope or encouraging false hope, overestimating what is possible or what is needed in terms of services and what results the authors can rightly expect from it.
Right.
The other aspect of predatory behaviors that I've seen in other companies is either overinflated fees or providing something that is of limited value, but for a jacked up price, such as, we'll write you a press release and calling that like a valuable marketing service when that really does little to nothing. I mean, it really does nothing to promote your book, just having a press release.
Or I used to see, one of these companies that would say, we'll take you to Book Expo and we'll, display your book on our show floor, which is a fine service, but it's a few $100 service, and they would charge something like 20 grand.
Right.
So, and we know that that's not worth that, but authors don't, because they're being sold this idea that that's actually a meaningful experience.
So let's go back to distribution for a moment, because that really is, I know that there's like a huge bun fight happening even within our little corner of the industry about, the value of distribution. With so many books being bought online these days, does it even matter to be in bookstores? When does it matter? For whom does it make sense? And is that really an important defining criterion to call oneself a bona fide hybrid publisher?
Well, I think where we've landed with the criteria and with the IBPA is that it's active distribution, right? That it doesn't necessarily need to be traditional distribution, which you and I both have, and to differentiate between traditional and active. Traditional distribution would mean that you have a sales force. And I always talk about it as a push, right? There's an active push into the marketplace. And so when our books go out, there's a guaranteed buy from retailers, which is based on our sales reps pushing books into sales channels. And when it's just active, all that means is that it's available. And so I think that there's a huge difference, and people don't always understand, right? The availability means you can pull, right? You can get it and it's available, but that's very, very different than a concerted push into retail markets. I also agree that not every publisher necessarily needs it. There are a lot of very niche publishers who don't benefit from brick and mortar sales. You and I do. I mean, my program, it absolutely is essential because we are primarily memoir and fiction. Authors want and need to be in bookstores. There's also the question of qualifying for traditional reviews, which is part and parcel of having traditional distribution, because if a big outlet is going to review your book, they need to be able to ensure that it's widely available. And so there's these questions of availability. And I think the reason that we have not made any kind of firm decision on the distribution question for the criteria really comes down to the fact that there are just so many different kinds of publishers out in the world, and some of them are doing a active, good job getting their books into the marketplace, but yet some of those marketplaces are niche markets.
Right. It comes down to like, what is the marketplace for you?
Yeah,
is
exactly.
it the general book buying population, which, is traipsing through airport bookstores and, looking at browsing at the books in Costco, et cetera? Or is it a really kind of defined walled market, such as church groups or types of education, or special interest
or
groups,
military, right? I mean, that's one of the ones that has come up. Yeah.
Right. Okay. We could talk about this all day, but there's too much other stuff to get to. So, I would love to ask you a little bit about your coaching. So you work personally with authors. I know you've been teaching a memoir class for many years, and you also work as a book coach directly with folks one-on-one. It seems to me that as busy as you are, and with your big job as publisher at She Writes and Spark Press, this is not really something that you necessarily need to be doing. So tell me what you get out of it, Brooke.
Yeah, it keeps me in the trenches. That's primarily what it comes down to. I really like working with authors one-on-one, and I get something out of it that is very different from my role as a publisher. And being a publisher is a very meta kind of job where you're overseeing a lot of stuff and you're making decisions, but it has a sort of treadmill aspect to it sometimes. It's cyclical. Things happen. You're coming in, you're putting out fires, blah, blah, blah. I like it and I'm very good at it, but it's way different than the co-creation process of working on a book with someone. And so it sort of all goes back to the beginning of my career, but especially at Seal Press, I was developing. I was an acquisitions editor who was deeply involved in the development of books. And it was the favorite part of my job, right? So this job that I created for myself, of being the publisher of She Writes Press, sort of edged that favorite part of my job out of the picture. And so it's a way that I can keep it, and I don't do it a lot. I probably am coaching in any given moment, maybe 6 authors.
Okay. That sounds like a lot to me, but okay. It's a lot to juggle, but
it is.
All right. And let's talk a little bit about, let's sort of share a bit of that wisdom that you give one-on-one with everyone who's listening. So I know that every situation is unique and every person is different. But I also know that there tend to be themes and trends and, common issues that crop up again and again when we're working with authors. What can you tell us about, where you notice that a lot of the authors that you work with tend to get stuck, and that could, be in the emotional realm, strategic realm, give us a couple of places where people get stuck and how you help them get unstuck.
People tend to reach out to me for issues of structure. I think I'm known to be a person who loves structure and thinks about structure. So I do get sought out for that, being like, there's something wrong with my structure and I don't really understand what it is, or they're willing to change it. So there's that. I do a lot of manuscript evaluations. And so clearly people get stuck in things like telling versus showing. It's very common. People get stuck in memoir specifically about really not knowing how to write in scene. They understand what scene is, but they don't stay in scene. And so they're doing these broad narrative summaries, and the scope of the memoir, is their whole life instead of a slice of life. So that's a big one. So I work with a lot of memoirists on that. I do still sometimes work with novelists, and novelists have logic issues to figure out a lot of times, inconsistencies or character motivations that don't make sense or are not totally accurate. So it's really interesting. I think it's like a puzzle. I think it's when I was talking earlier about like engaging my brain, I like finding the things that like motivationally or sort of from the character drives maybe need to be finessed or thought through a little bit more.
I'm so impressed that you work with so much narrative-based writing, because I find that is just so much more complicated than prescriptive nonfiction or information-based writing. So it sounds like whether you're talking about fiction, like a novel, or memoir, which is nonfiction but still narrative nonfiction, and that is just. It's kind of a mysterious world to me how you solve those problems. But I have recognized certainly the issue of people thinking that my memoir is the story of my life, and the manuscript tends to spool out kind of like and then like this happened, that happened, that happened, that happened, and that's just not the way great stories are told. So. What would you say about, we all have a very immersive experience of our lives, of course. And although there are sort of strands and story arcs that happen within our lives, those story arcs are constantly like intersecting each other and complicating our experience of our narrative. Can you give us a piece of advice, in general terms, which I appreciate is difficult, but like where to set the frame, how to focus, and how to recognize that like, this thing that I experienced is a story worth telling.
Right. Yeah. And exactly. I was going to say it totally depends on the genre that you're writing, of course, but you're asking about memoir, which is very helpful. Right. And within memoir, these questions of the episodes of your life, right? So I teach a lot of memoir, and we talk in the beginning stages of memoir about turning points. Like, what are these very meaningful moments in your life that matter? And most people can focus in and really pinpoint the major events that they want to write about. And so it's helpful. It's just kind of like zooming that lens out. And then once you're out at that, 10,000 view, then kind of going, okay, now let's zoom back in. And I think the thing that tends to happen is that people eventually realize that they have or could write more than one memoir. And so they've been told, you should write a memoir, or I have always wanted to write a memoir. And they're trying to tackle way, way too big a part of their lives, in essence, their whole lives. And so it's about trying to pinpoint, scale back, but yeah, figuring out which ones have the most juice for you. What do you circle?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that have been particularly meaningful? And also, what are the experiences that you have that you feel like you can really unpack meaning?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the type of memoir that also blends some sort of teaching element that, I got sober and here's how, or I, lived through this health crisis and here's what it, or some parenting situation or career situation. What advice would you share about how to do that skillfully?
Yeah, I love those kinds of memoirs. And I think they're increasingly popular because having a prescriptive element will make them more saleable. The people are like, oh, it's a memoir, but it also has these little nuggets of a prescriptive takeaway for me. And doing it well combines good aspects of nonfiction writing, because that kind of stuff is formulaic. And so if you're going to be offering some sort of prescriptive, takeaway for your reader within your memoir, they need to know when to expect it. It can't just show up anywhere, like random boxes or inconsistent, right? You have to really think about it like you would a nonfiction book, where you're saying, okay, I'm going to have this element, right? There's going to be like a list here. There's going to be subheads. There's going to be a shaded box that, when the reader sees that, they know what that is. So it requires, that's why they're often called hybrid memoirs, because it requires you to be writing a memoir, but also the hybrid aspect is, what are this like nonfiction prescriptive aspect that you're going to be weaving in?
Right. And it can be difficult to balance it. And I think especially when there are a lot of these types of blended memoirs that may not be strictly prescriptive, as in here are my steps, but that may be reflections and insights, so perhaps you're kind of like rotating through a range of kind of insights that you gleaned from your experience and how the reader might apply those insights to their own situation.
Absolutely. And some people are really good at that. Some people really are heavy on those kinds of takeaways because they know how to deliver them in a good way, or you learn how to deliver them in a good way, because sometimes that stuff can feel a little heavy-handed or obvious if you are kind of laying down and here's what I learned. So I think it's really important for people who have that intention to, either work with a coach or a good editor or someone who's going to give them feedback around, is this landing as something that feels like it's for the reader and not didactic and just like, here's what I think you should do.
Not preaching from on high. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We were talking just before we began recording about, this question of, is there any situation or kind of person in which you would say, like, actually, you know what, maybe don't write that book, or this is I think a lot of people come to this experience wondering whether they have it in them, whether their idea is worthy, whether their own talent or skill level makes it a worthwhile endeavor, and the answer is that we often shortchange ourselves and underestimate what we're capable of. But there are cases in which, that's kind of a stretch, what you're contemplating doing. What can you tell me about what you'd say, are there cases in which, no, you maybe shouldn't write that book?
Yeah. And I believe that there's so many levels of support that writers can get that perhaps someone truly needs a ghostwriter or a very heavy developmental edit. I have seen work that I thought like, wow, this is unpublishable, and have said to the writer, you have a long ways to go. So either you need to learn how to do this, which might be like go back to class, or you could partner with someone, because sometimes people have really amazing stories, but they don't know how to execute it on the page. So I'm a big fan, obviously, because of my role as a coach and other things, of getting support to execute something if you don't have the actual skill set. Then beyond skill set, there are questions of, is it too raw? Is it too close? I think sometimes, especially memoirists, need distance. Is it going to cause harm to someone else or harm to yourself? Sometimes writing trauma is healing for people, but sometimes it actually exacerbates the trauma. And I have seen that happen with people. And so people need to be mindful about where they're coming from, what their motivations are, why are they writing the book, and what is the actual process. Like, in the process of writing, is it cathartic, or does it just feel like you're actually, self-flagellating the whole time, right? And sometimes people don't have that perspective. So I think it's a big and important and complicated question, and people also are loath to give things up once they've started. And yet sometimes that is the healthiest thing that someone can do.
Right. But you think that there's a lot that we can do to bridge the gap of our weaknesses or qualities that may be underdeveloped, and that the key to bridging that gap is finding the right support.
I mean, absolutely, because, we're recording this as Spare is making such a huge splash in the world. And, Prince Harry is not a writer. And in fact, some of the worst press about him has been somewhat disparaging of his intellectualism. And J.R. Mooringer, who ghost wrote that book, is a phenomenal writer. And, that story is getting consumed very broadly and is sort of a memoir phenomenon of this decade, right? And should he have written it? No.
You mean should Prince Harry have personally written the words?
Right.
Yeah. No, of course not. Right.
No, of course it would have been horrible. Right. And so it's this gorgeous writing experience, whether or not you're interested in his story or not. J.R. Mooringer did a great job. So, for people who really want to have their story out there, and that's what ghostwriters do. So right. Yes, I believe in support.
So we've talked about several of your areas of work, but we still have several to go. So talk to me about your I guess, for want of a better word, your role as a public figure, your media activities. You write a column for Publishers Weekly, which is our trade journal, industry trade journal. You write, you have a weekly podcast, the Right Minded podcast. You are a public speaker. A lot of publishing professionals are kind of more comfortable behind the scenes, and editors are often, kind of camera shy. What was it like to push yourself into the spotlight and make a public figure of yourself? Why did you do it, and what feelings did you have around that? I'm curious about, listen, I'm famous for loading 7 questions onto one, but I'm curious about whether this was a conscious and deliberate decision, and if so, why and what did it take?
Yeah, when I was at Seal, especially, I did a lot of conferences. Seal Press is, and particularly was, a darling. People love Seal Press, and it's a women's press. And I got a lot of invitations to come to conferences and, sit on panels. I never did any plenary talks or anything, though. It was just sort of small scale. And then I would do a lot of one-on-ones, and I enjoyed it. But it was not until I left Seal and all of this stuff converged for me, because I realized, I needed to be out in the world talking about what She Writes Press was and what we were trying to do. And I believed from day one, obviously, in the mission and the importance. And as soon as we started getting backlash about our business model, I took it personally. I was like, I'm going to get out there and just start talking and writing. And people would talk to me like, She Writes is doing such great books. Why don't you just not talk about your business model? Why don't you just shut up and, get your books out there and everybody will think you're traditional? And I was so offended by that. I was like, the whole point is to have transparency, and to show the world that our books are as good as any other books and that it's not about who's paying and the business model and the stupid conversation that happens, among publishing professionals, because the readers don't care, right? The readers care about a good book. So I was pushed in a certain sense by my passion to be public speaking, because I realized, of course, that it brought some eyeballs to She Writes, but primarily because I really care, and I find that, of course, when you have a public platform, you get to put your ideas out there. And I think, for our industry and what I'm doing, the things that I have to say about hybrid publishing in particular, but other kinds of advocacy really do matter. And that I'm one of the people who understands the ins and outs. And so I have just kept at it.
Was that always comfortable for you, or did you ever, was it going against your own nature or self-preservation instincts to stick your head above the parapet?
I think I got better at it. I think like I mentioned anger earlier. I can be quite driven by anger sometimes. And I think a lot of us can be, which is a form of passion. And so when I'm angry about something and I see it's an injustice, I'm thinking about my discomfort, but only my discomfort in like, oh my gosh, I'm so incensed. Right. And the public speaking has been something I've clearly gotten better at the more I do it. I've grown into it. I was not naturally good at it, but it's something that I like the challenge that it gives me, like the fact that I still get nervous every time I speak. There's a growth edge there, right, that I find is maybe good for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, since this podcast is really about, what it takes to put yourself out there in the world in a really big way, of course, that, pertains a lot to writing books, but also, this advocacy work that you do. I'm curious about whether you have a story to share about, a time when it was difficult to do, or you had some, blowback or criticism that made you question your decision to be so outspoken. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, there's been moments, there were a particular moment where I got an award at BISG, which is like the Book Industry Study Group, for some innovative publisher award, right? And it was at that place that someone walked up to me and said, I just don't understand, why you are so proud of your business model, like authors are paying. And it was hurtful, but I was also there receiving an award for innovation. It was like this very ironic moment where I'm like, but I'm getting the award for this very reason, yet you're telling me like my business model sucks, so you have to like keep buoying yourself, which I think also serves me well for the writers I work with. Like when you put your writing out there, when you put yourself out there, there's always going to be people who don't like what you're doing, and some of them will be vocal, and so then you can let that eat at you. Right. And sometimes I have, sometimes I'll perseverate over someone I don't even know, their comment on something that I wrote, who doesn't even know what they're talking about. And it just gnaws at me. And so I've found like it is difficult, and you have to just keep at it, right? And if it's your writing or it's your passion, in my case, about our business model and hybrid and the work that we're doing in the world, I always am centered by the fact that I know we're doing good work, right? And so like I just focus on like stop the noise and look at what we're doing. And luckily I, get that feedback sometimes as well. So it's not, it's internal and external.
Yeah. So it's not just about growing a thick skin and not caring about what people say. It's refocusing your attention on what truly matters.
Yeah, definitely.
And along those lines, I was thinking about what you said about the criticism from some of your peers in the publishing industry saying, why don't you just like keep your mouth shut about the fact that, you have a fee for service business model, just do the books. And what it makes me think of is that there's some sort of, we know that traditional publishing companies have been cutting hybrid deals on the down low forever,
Right.
And that there have been author subsidized contracts since forever in every house, basically. But that they also come kind of cloaked in shame. And what it sounded like to me was that person giving you, that piece of criticism, or maybe they interpreted it as advice, was essentially, projecting what would be their shameful feeling about that activity onto you, rather than, as you said, standing in the light of transparency and owning it and feeling proud of it for logical reasons.
Well, totally. But I also think that some of the authors who cut those deals with traditional houses are the most entrepreneurial, right? They understand that they're getting something really profound out of those deals, which is these very high royalties. So at the company that I worked at, North Atlantic Books, the reason that I started hybrid publishing in the first place was because we were doing hybrid. We called it co-publishing. And then there were distribution deals where the authors would get 70%. And those authors were always the most high profile, the ones who sold the most, because they were coming specifically because they didn't want the terrible traditional deal that was only going to give them a 7% royalty. They wanted the big money because they were the biggest sellers. So I think it's like, it's cloaked in shame on the one hand, maybe, but I also think it's cloaked in like, we don't want people to know what the behind the scenes business deals are, because it would somehow lessen the success of the company. So that's how I saw it, and it could be both. It could be a mixture depending on what it is. But more than anything, it's just also buoying this idea that publishing should not be transparent to authors and to the public, which you and I both share that, wanting to just smash that, right? Because it doesn't serve anyone, except
right. So I think what you're saying is that it might not be so much of an emotional reason for wanting to keep those deals under wraps, but a strategic one. Like, let's not tip our hand. Let's not show what we're giving someone else. Right.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I know that, we both believe in the opposite of that, which is empowerment and transparency. Okay. Time to shift gears. I want to ask you about your own creative process. You are an author. You've written multiple books. My question is, what has it taken for you to write those books? And I recognize that you've got so many under your belt that the answer is going to be different. But if you could just speak to me for a minute with your author hat on, about your the writing process, but also what have you put into it in terms of time, support, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. I need support. I think it's because of the time. I will always prioritize everything else. And so I need to find some sort of time/accountability person, or people. So I've always had either accountability partners. Eventually I will have an editor. Like at the time, for right now, I'm working on a book and I just have an accountability partner that I'm sending pages to. But I've always set up structures. They have been different for every book, kind of depending on where I am in my life. But yeah, I've hired coaches, I've hired copy editors, proofreaders. Yes, I'm a big believer in support, as previously mentioned.
Tell me about the accountability partner and the pages that you send them. I'm so curious. Yeah. How often, how many pages, what are the consequences if you're late? Do you have to give each other $10 or something?
That's a good one. We might have to start doing that if we actually stop sending, but we're so motivated, right? Both of us are doing this because we really want to send pages. And so it's 2,000 to 2,500 words a week. And you can exceed that if you want to. But it's, once a week. We have to send on Mondays. I've been late, but I have, followed up and sent. So it's just about knowing that that person is expecting the pages and that she's sending me pages, right? So I'm not saying it's competitive. It's not, but like if she sends me pages and I don't send her pages, it feels like a lack of reciprocity. So there's
Yeah.
something in that that is also motivating.
I love that. It's like, just hacking human psychology to make it work for you.
Definitely.
And what about time? How long will it take you to write? And again, I recognize that right now you're working on a personal memoir, which is probably a completely different kettle of fish. But do you have a sort of a sense of like, no, it takes me like X number of months to do my first draft?
Yeah, it is different than anything I've ever done before. And so I think it will be a lot longer because I'm expecting more revision. When I wrote my previous books, not that there was no revision, but I'm an expert. I know what I'm talking about. Prescriptive books, you kind of come and you're like, here's what I have to say. And as long as you map it out really well, in my experience, you have a strong outline, you know what you're going to say, then you kind of plug in the pieces. And narrative creative fiction is not that way. You could plug in the pieces and be like, wow, well, that was a horrible scene. It has nothing to do with anything. So, and then this idea of extracting meaning. So I plan to finish the draft by summer, but I think I'm going to need a year of revision. I mean, just based on what I want it to be and the iterations that I'm expecting.
So we are recording this in February. You're talking about summer for your first draft completion. And when did you start? Like, are we talking about 6 or 8 months for the first draft and then a year for, what was?
I started in October and I'm 20,000 words in, so I guess if, October to summer, right? Maybe like 9 months for a first draft, right? Just to get those 80,000 words on the page. And then from there to spend, as much time or more revising.
I love that, Brooke. You've given yourself a really sensibly spacious time frame in which to do this. And these days, maybe it was always this way, but I think especially these days we have such a kind of an immediate gratification, sort of ethos in our society, and a lot of messaging that says that, you can crank your book out fast. And here you are, a bona fide expert in the process, and really not rushing it, which just tells me that the wisdom is to don't rush it.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I have a big job and a big life. And so I don't have the luxury of taking 6 months off to go work on my book. And some people do, and that's great for them. But I think you're right that there is an ethos in it. And I also think there's a lot of people kind of peddling like, oh, you can do this fast, and I actually teach a 6-month memoir class, but the point is not about like cranking it out fast. It's about a reasonable deadline and also writing as much as you can or ever have. And it's much more about the accountability rather than the fastness. But I can't tell you how many programs I see out there, people being like, get this done and published in 3 months or 6 months. And it's harrowing because
it drives me bananas. It's one of my biggest bugbears. I can't stand it. I mean, 3 months, 6 months. I see things that are 10 days or ridiculous.
Yeah, no, that's insane.
Ridiculous. It's that practice does not support excellence.
No, it's like starving yourself. It's like, we'll go on this, no eat diet for 10 days and then you will be emaciated and you'll feel great, right? It's like, no, it doesn't work that way, right? And this is about a habit and supporting yourself to also really be immersed in your creative process. And I think that it is a journey. It shouldn't be rushed.
So a creative process and also, trips down memory lane and, emotional and psychological kind of processing that naturally happens when we encounter the material of our lives on the page rather than just rattling around in our heads and hearts as it's always been. What would you be prepared to share about how, getting 20,000 words into your memoir how has it been emotionally?
It's been interesting and really beautiful in some ways. I'm writing about a previous relationship. And one of the things I can say that's surprising is that it's brought already so much compassion, both for myself and for that ex-partner, which I wasn't expecting. I think I'm sort of falling in love with us again and what that was for us back then, right? And so there's a way that you're reliving. And if you're not harboring any particular feeling, you really can re-immerse yourself into what was. And I think that's why people will say that it's very healing, and it gives you a new and a different perspective. And that's already happening.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it can be a real growth experience.
Yeah.
So, because you're making this shift from it, just again, as an author, from writing primarily prescriptive nonfiction books about the subject of your expertise into this very kind of like creative and personal realm, how is that shifting your author brand or your idea of yourself as an author, how readers will understand you and receive you?
I think it's just that it's time, right? I think I've always been immersed in memoir. Seal was all about memoir. She Writes is all about memoir. I teach memoir. So I haven't written my own memoir. It felt like now this next book, this is what was being called forth. My entire brand is really about championing women's voices. And so this is just finally me saying, well, I'm also just going to champion my own voice and my own story. I mean, I've written these other books, and it's not to say none of them have been personal, but this will by far be the most personal. But I think it's very in keeping with how I put myself out there in the world. I am pretty open, and I am intentionally, I am that way, but I'm okay with being that way, as a publisher, because I work with women, and I'm trying to model a particular kind of spaciousness and saying, your story matters. And if I'm living my life that way, I think they feel embraced and know that I am quite serious about that intention, and that it's more than an intention. It's a way that I live my life, but also, of course, run the publishing house.
Yeah, you're really walking the talk. And so I suppose in your case, because of the type of publishing that you do and because of the type of coaching that you do, this is far less of a stretch than it would be if you were publishing in a different arena.
I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's not, but I'm finding that these many, many, many years of teaching memoir is proving quite helpful for writing my own memoir. I actually know how to write a scene, right? I know how to extract meaning from things, but the bar is also higher in some ways, because I think there will be a high expectation. Like, I better write a good memoir and not make any kind of rookie mistakes.
Well, that was my next question. Both. So yeah, how is that, how is that challenging you?
In the beginning, a lot, and I gave myself permission to just do what I say to my students, the what happened draft, which is why I know that I'm going to spend a lot of time in revision, because I was trying to be too great out the gate. And I just need to mine what happened and remember and put the details on the page and write the scenes. And I will have plenty of time to go back and make it pretty later. So it took a minute, though, like a good month of me just being like, oh my gosh, this is boring and awful. And then I was like, it's just put it on the page. But a lot of self-talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, this is something that you've been coaching other people through for a really long time, right? Sort of grappling with the ego and the part of the ego which wants to cower in fear of exposure and
absolutely
all of those internal demons. We have them even when we know them inside out for other people.
I think that's the point, right? Is like, you can be doing something and be at the top of your game, and you're still going to confront the exact same stuff that everyone else is going through. I'm not exempt because I have a deeper psychological understanding of it. And that's helpful. I actually think it really reminds me once again, and I've been reminded many, 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 many times, right? But like, what authors go through, what writers confront when they're in it. And ultimately, I think it absolutely makes me a better publisher.
Mm-hmm. Now, the final kind of like piece in the process, of course, once it has been written and edited and prepared and put on the page and all that, I know that's a long way off still, but at some point you will publish this memoir and share it publicly. let's talk about that really all important aspect of the publishing process. And in this case, I'd love for you to speak not just, about your own situation, but how you counsel authors. You spoke a little while ago about that you never want to reject a book based on a limited platform, and yet you also must know, obviously, about the value of an author platform in getting the word out. So you are a person who has done all the right things in terms of building your platform. It's been gradual. It is deep and real. The people who listen to you and know about you for reasons that are connected to the books that you write. And so you have a really good, strong, organically grown foundation on which to promote your book. What can you share with listeners about how, advice that you give authors on how to do that, and the time that it takes, the investments that it takes, how to think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do believe that having a book is the springboard that you need to build an author platform. So there are a lot of authors who will publish with us who don't have much of anything of an author platform. And I believe that they are using their books to build an author platform and to, give themselves legitimacy in essence to be guests on podcasts or to sit on panels or whatever the stuff might be. So I already have books and I already have a platform. This will be different. I don't know yet, how big I will push out a publicity effort, but with each subsequent book that I've published, my publicity effort has been bigger. So I think that will be something. And I mainly care about it being well received. Yes, I want to sell books, right? But this is also just about, like you said, walking my talk, that it's time that I have been teaching memoir. I want to publish a memoir, and I have incredibly realistic expectations around sales, lucky me, because I get to pour over royalty statements. So I get it. So I think I'm well positioned for this just to be part of my body of work, that it's not so much about like, I'm going to be the next Elizabeth Gilbert. It's not what I'm trying to do here. And that gives me a lot of freedom, like I have a sense of who I am in the world and how I want this book to be additive, but I'm not trying to like become a breakout memoirist. And people have different goals,
Yeah.
So
yeah. And it's, of course, it's very difficult for the uninitiated to accurately place themselves in that sort of like, landscape of likelihood. People come to us sometimes, with the goal of, I want to be a New York Times bestseller, and Jove, I'm going to do it.
That's a common one.
And what I think you're saying is that is not the only metric of success. That's not the only measure that says this was a worthwhile thing to do. I am a successful author. But do you have, kind of goals around either, sales figures or impact, or how you want this book to open things up for you, or, anything other than, as you said, adding to the body of your work and it just being the right time?
Well, sales are really hard for me because I have previous books and I know what it takes. And I think I have realistic expectations around sales in ways that 99% of authors do not.
Would you share a number with me? Like, what would you consider to be like, okay, this is the threshold of it worked. And then what is the threshold of like, now I'm really happy?
Yeah. So you and I probably also think about this similarly, right? It's like there's year one and then there's everything else, right? So in year one, I would be happy and consider myself successful if I sold between, 2,500 and 3,000 copies because of the genre, because of what it is, right? And I think different people have different expectations, but it's a competitive space. And, I have a platform, but it's not giant, right? And not everybody is going to buy your book. So there's that. And if it was 5,000, that would far exceed, anything. So it's about also the longevity of that book, right? It being out there in a meaningful way, much past 1 year for me to have as something that I will teach on and speak about. And, in all likelihood, there will be some talk that grows out of the work of doing the memoir, right? So I'm thinking about it as I think I use the example of like tapestry or mosaic, right? I mean, it's all part of a bigger effort.
I love that. What a very, very helpful reality check. Thank you for just like being unafraid to share the numbers, because you're right. People have all kinds of, it's impossible to know from the outside what is within the zone of realistic and what is way outside of it.
Absolutely. And most authors think that 10,000 copies is just like the baseline. I can't even tell you how many times I hear that. Like, well, I'll sell 10,000 copies. And it's like, authors don't understand what 10,000 copies are, nor that's
hard to do. Most books don't achieve that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Most books don't. Right. And so I do provide these reality checks to my own authors. And also it helps you to set your own expectations around happiness, because if you're going to fall short of 10,000, that's like most people. But if you fall short of 2,000, then maybe you could say, okay, well, what was I attempting to do here? And it depends on your genre, right? I mean, if you are like an expert in your space, like a Marie Kondo or something, then the expectations are going to be much higher. Everybody needs your book. People don't need fiction and memoir in the same way that they need a book for how to get your life organized, so it needs to have a different threshold.
But I really, really love the emphasis that you're placing on, that you want it to be well received. You want it to be taken seriously. You want it to be the very best book that it can be. And that for you is an important part of measuring success.
100%. Yes. I mean, this will be something that is the most meaningful to me, right? That it just be well received by my peers, and that my students, that I will be proud for my students to read it and say, okay, well, I've learned something about the genre for having read this book. That would be for me, the most important.
Brooke, I could talk to you all day. There are a zillion things that we could do deep dive on, but I have kept you long enough. I just want to thank you so much for spending an hour with me here. Where can people find you on the internet?
Thank you so much, Maggie. I have too many URLs. So brookewarner.com is the one that sort of centralizes everything. If people are interested in the press, please check out shewritespress.com. And then I teach a lot of memoir classes, and that's at magicofmemoir.com. So I don't know when this is airing, but I have a spring class. So if there are some aspiring memoirists out there and they want to check that out, that would be great.
That's great. Thank you so very much, Brooke. I hope you'll come back one day and we'll drill a little deeper into some of those side topics.
I'd love it. Anytime.
Thank you.
I really hope this conversation has inspired you to give so much of your gift to the world that it expands you into your greatest possible version of yourself. Remember, it's not selfish just because we also benefit from it. And here's where I get to make a selfish request. New podcasts need all the help they can get. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Selfish Gift Podcast. And send me a DM. I'd love to hear how you're sharing your gift with the world.